Department of History here at Salve, Regina University. Welcome to tonight's lecture by Brigadier General Ty Seidule. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank my colleague and friend, Dr. Jim Ludis, the Executive Director of the Pell Center, for co-sponsoring tonight's event. I would also like to thank my colleagues in the History Department, Dr. Tim Neary and Dr. John Quinn, for providing additional funding for tonight's event through the John E. McGinty Fund in History. Lastly, thank you to Teresa Haas and Aaron Barry at the Pell Center and Melissa Davis, the Program Administrator for the Pell Honors Program, for helping to organize and advertise tonight's event. It is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Ty Seidule is a visiting professor of history at Hamilton College and professor emeritus of history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from Washington and Lee University, where he was a distinguished military graduate, and his master's degree and doctorate in history from The Ohio State University. He served on active duty in the United States Army for 36 years, retiring in 2020 as a Brigadier General. During his long career, he served in armor and cavalry units in peace and in war in the United States, the Balkans, Germany, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kenya. He also taught for many years in the Department of History at West Point, serving as the chief of the Military History Division, the deputy department head, and the department head. He is the author of Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause, the subject of tonight's lecture, as well as the editor of the award-winning West Point History of Warfare book series. He has also published numerous articles, book chapters, and opinion pieces. General Seidule served as the vice chair of the Congressional Naming Commission from 2021 to 2022, which successfully led the effort to rename the military installations and facilities named after Confederate officers. And he is a member of the advisory board for the National World War II Museum. Please welcome Brigadier General Ty Seidule.
Can you hear me? Ready? All right. Thank you, Bill, so much for the invitation. I'd like to thank the Pell Center. Jim, thank you so much for being here. Madam President, I know the President's here. Thank you, Kelly, for inviting me. It's a great honor for me to be here. I'm also happy to, my wife is here, Sherry, who is the hero of this book, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her as we go along. But it's great to be at Salve. It's great to be in Newport, and it's just great to be together after such a long time not being able to do that. So thank you, everyone. And I did want to give a shout out to, I don't know if any of the students that are here that did the book club with Robert E. Lee and me. Anybody here that did the book club? All right. All right. Over here as well. Thank you for doing that. I look forward to some questions about that. So I am here to talk to you about my book and the sort of the, I got to get my special thing that, wait a minute, I know I've got something here that will forward the, oh, here it is, look, here it is. So I'm here, this is sort of the thesis of it, which is, you know, and it's okay to be uncomfortable. Hopefully I make a couple of you uncomfortable tonight, but that we have a racist past. That's okay, we can handle it. We Americans aren't made out of cotton candy. But the only way to deal with that past is, the only way to deal with it and make sure we don't have that future is to talk about the past. And the thing about it is that history is dangerous. And I say that history is dangerous because it goes after our myths and our identities. And when somebody challenges those myths or identities, the reaction can be ferocious. And I found this out in 2015. In late 2014, early 2015, I was flogging one of our books, The West Point History of the Civil War, and they came to me and said, hey, listen, Ty, we want you to do the publicist for the press, and we want to do a video for the for this PragerU. It's a very conservative organization. What was the cause of the Civil War? And so I said, do I have academic freedom? Yes. So I probably didn't look at it maybe as closely as I should have, but I went and did it in uniform. And what I said is that the citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve a morally repugnant institution of slavery. That's what I said. And it came out, I did it early 2015, and it came out a month after a white supremacist waving the Confederate flag slaughtered 9 churchgoers in Charleston at Mother Emanuel Church. And so the reaction was ferocious. I got death threats to my West Point email, to an Army officer's email. The Army investigated me for political speech, for saying the Civil War was about slavery. The Nation on the left side said I was a propagandist for the Army, the Nation magazine, and Stars and Stripes said I was too close to a political organization. So West Point, I thought I was going to lose my job for saying the Civil War was about slavery. And since then, it's had close to 35 million views for history. And an Army officer went viral. The Army does not like having its officers go viral. Let me just tell you that right now. But what I found out is that, I also found out is that when you become public like this, people troll you. This may shock you, but there are trolls out there that will come after you. And what they came after me particularly is for this visage, for this look that you see right here. So, in fact, you will see many of the ones that came after, and yeah, I know. They had a problem with my head. They really did. You know, as bald men, there's some bald men here in the audience. Nothing wrong with that. But they were, so yeah, this is, and it still happens to this day. I still get an amazing amount. I had to take my phone number off the Hamilton College website because I get so many people calling me. And you can follow me on social media once a month or so. I do a Tuesday troll. To some of the one-star Amazon reviews, some of the terrible things that people say. But what I found is that history is dangerous. And I found that out even more. So I was chair of the Memorialization Committee at West Point, and I had this idea to recognize those who had died in the wars on terror, who had died fighting for their country in Iraq and Afghanistan. And West Point had over 100 people killed in the wars on terror. And just to let you know what that meant, sort of a look at comparison, Yale in World War I had 10 times the number killed in World War I that West Point did. 10 times. And yet since 2001, Yale has had not one die, and West Point over 100. So the community was really reeling about this. I had this idea to repurpose an existing room in our Memorial Hall and put the 1,550-some names of those who, in Lincoln's word, gave the last full measure of devotion, who died for their nation. Great, had it all ready to go. And then money, everything else. And then finally, I went up to brief our senior leaders on this. And I said, well, listen, this is great. Everybody says great, but you can't put the Confederates in there. No, because they fought against their country. They killed U.S. Army soldiers. They abrogated their oath. And they fought to, the worst, as Grant said, for the worst possible reason, to create a slave republic. Slam dunk argument. It was brilliant. It was a brilliant argument. And they did not buy it. They said, no, we want to bring people together. We don't want to be like the Sunni and Shia fighting for centuries, which is, in my humble opinion, the worst historical analogy in the history of the world. But I lost. So I go back, tail between my legs, to talk to my wife, to talk to Sherry, and say, they did not buy my brilliant argument. And she said, well, Ty, did you tell them why this is so important to you? Why you're so passionate about this? He said, did you tell them your story? I said, no. Historians tell other people's stories. They don't tell their own. And she said, well, listen, if you're ever going to have any success telling people about this history, you got to fess up about your own background. I went, oh my God, she's right. Not an unusual occurrence in our household. But she's right, and that I did indeed need to tell my own story, because the problem is that the mainly white men around that room who decided to put those Confederates grew up with the same thing that I did, which is called the lost cause of the Confederacy myth. Now, some of you, those of you who have read the book may know this, but I thought I'd go in and talk about that. What is the lost cause of the Confederacy myth? That is, imagine that you're the white South. Remember, when we say the South, usually the white is silent. When the white South went to war to protect and expand slavery, they sowed the wind and they reaped the whirlwind. How do they deal with this catastrophic defeat, this destruction of society that they did? Well, they came up with basically lies to hide the fact of what this war was really about. So the war wasn't about slavery. Well, that's just bunk. Read the secession declarations of every southern state, and it will tell you that they fought this war to protect, as Mississippi said, to protect the benefits of African slavery. All the states said this. The second one is there's this myth that somehow the enslaved people were happy in their condition, that they liked slavery. Well, this is just a monstrous lie. Slavery featured legal rape. Most white young men had their first sexual experience in the South with an enslaved girl or woman. And you can check that out because most who trace their ancestry to the enslaved era have about 20% European DNA. That's because rape was ubiquitous. That somehow they sold families apart. Slavery broke apart families, husband from wife, children from mothers. It is an absolutely evil system. And yet somehow they argue that there's happy slaves. I'll go through some of these. I think I'll concentrate on the Reconstruction one. That after the war, they said that this myth came up that the Reconstruction, that's that period from 1865 to 1877, was a failure. And it was a failure because black people weren't ready for the vote. Well, that's just a lie. 2,000 black men served in high office in the South between 1865 and 1877. Reconstruction, that period, was our best chance, our best shot at a biracial democracy for over 100 years. And yet, if you grow up with this lost cause myth like I did as a kid growing up in Virginia and Georgia, you would have thought that Reconstruction was a failure because the South, there were scalawags. Scalawags were white Southerners who were with the Republican Party, who were working for biracial democracy, or there were carpetbaggers coming from the North to steal. There was nothing left to steal in the South. So, and then at the top of this myth is Robert E. Lee, the finest, not just the best general, but the finest human to ever walk the earth. And I'll talk more about that at the end. But this matters. Why does this lost cause matter? It matters because along with these new Jim Crow, all the southern states redo their constitutions between 1890 and 1920 to exclude black people purposely from the democratic process. So these new laws, new constitutions create a segregated society. To enforce that, there's lynching. White Terror Campaign, where over 5,000 black people are lynched in the American South. Change the voting laws. And at the same time, Confederate monuments. That's when all the Confederate monuments go up. Outside courthouses, because the only way black people are allowed in courthouses as either a custodian or a defendant. And why does this matter is because this is the ideological foundation of a racial police state. Let me say that again. The South of my birth, because of these, is an apartheid state, a racial police state, and that is what I was born into. And so that's me on the far right. Listen, I'm proud of that hair. I'm even more proud of those pants. And if I had the hair, I would wear the pants to this day. So that's me in Alexandria, Virginia. I don't know, I'm probably 11, 12, 13. And above above the mantle in the Sidgley House was this. CSA, Confederate States of America, this is what my dad had, Dixie across the bottom. I will be honest with you that I learned the words to Dixie before I learned the words to the Star Spangled Banner. And the words Dixie, I wish I was in the land of cotton, old times there are not forgotten, is telling us that the benefits of slavery, and how great slavery is, what a great part of life that was. It's monstrous, but that's what that song is about. And these flags are the flags of the Confederacy. The one on the far right was the Confederate national flag for most of the Confederacy's existence. The one third from right, second from left, that was the original one. Looked too much like the stars and like our flag. So they did away with that. Why is the one on the right? Why white? Why would you have that as it was called the Stainless Banner? And as the Charleston Mercury or one of the Savannah newspapers said, white for the purpose of what we're fighting for. White for the white people of the South, for the purity of our cause. It's white for white supremacy. It does turn out, any of you served in the military or anywhere else may know this, turns out a white flag on the battlefield is not a great idea. Not good. So they changed that, and the far left is the bloodstained banner. And the one second from right is the one that's caused so much trouble for the last 150, 60 years. That was never the Confederate national flag. It was the flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's army. And why choose that flag? Because it's the only one that had any success whatsoever. Everybody else failed. But at least from 1862 to the middle of 1863, Lee was successful with that, and that's what they chose in the 1890s to represent the Confederacy. So every part of my life reinforced the idea that Lee was the greatest human that ever lived, that the South were honorable but defeated people. So on your far left is my first chapter book, Meet Robert E. Lee. And I read that till I almost wore the cover off. And you can see the little line in the upper right-hand corner. You know, this is a book for kids. Open it up, and there's this thing from Steve Myers, second grader, Chicago. It's great. Teachers love it. And you can see him. He looks like he's a military god on loan from Mount Olympus. Traveler, his horse, is so smart, he doesn't even have to hold the reins. Yeah, there are problems there. And in the middle is my 7th grade textbook in the state of Virginia, created by the state of Virginia to ensure that young kids in Virginia got the proper education. And what does that education need to know? That segregation was good, the best way of life, and that slavery, and people said, make slavery look as good as possible. So what is this picture of? This is a picture of an African family on the Middle Passage coming from Africa to Virginia, sir, to enter into permanent enslavement for them, their sons, their daughters, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. And you look at it, and it looks like they're just off a Princess cruise ship. The horror of what the Middle Passage is, of 15% of dead, humans stacked. That's how much space they had. It's terrible. But that's what the state of Virginia wanted me to know. And on the far right, your far right, Gone with the Wind, my first chapter book. Many of you may remember that time when you were a kid, when you read something and realized that reading is better than a movie. That you could become so lost in a story that it's that it's better than a movie. Well, that was what Gone with the Wind was for me. I read it in the sixth grade, I think. And then as soon as I finished it, I read it again. It's like 400,000 words. Couldn't stop. Well, then I went back and reread it for this book, for when I was doing this book. It is monstrous again. Every lie of the lost cause myth, every terrible thing you could say about black people and freedmen are in there. It's terrible. It really is among the most racist books of the 20th century. And Gore Vidal once said, the great sort of literary guy, that whoever screens the history makes the history. And because that movie is so successful, it leads people back to the book. In 2014, Americans were asked, what is your favorite book? What's your favorite book? Number 1, the Bible. Number 2, Gone with the Wind. Number 3, Harry Potter series. Number 4, Lord of the Rings. So it just shows you how much this was in. So this is my hometown, Alexandria, Virginia. Anybody have been to D.C.? Been lots of people, right? Did you know that Alexandria and Arlington, right where the Pentagon is, that area, used to be part of the District of Columbia? I didn't know that. And so those granite pillars, the 100 square miles, which was created by, if you've seen Hamilton, the room where it happens, that is what they created. They said, we're going to put it here. But then Washington said, oh, no, you're going to put my hometown of Alexandria, Virginia in there as well. And so Alexandria down the bottom left was part of that. It retroceded, went back to Virginia in 1847. Why? To protect the slave trade. They feared that the slave trade would be outlawed in the District of Columbia. It was in 1850, so they did that to do that. And what happened after that, there's many people writing about what the free black people of Alexandria were talking about, which is wailing and lamentation because all the schools would have to close, churches would have to shut down, you could no longer teach reading, and all the black people would have to leave Alexandria. So I go again, the south of my birth, racial police state. This Confederate Monument, which is now gone. In the 6th grade, I was excited. 6th grade, I'm a child of the integration movement. I was bused across town from the white elementary school, Douglas MacArthur, to the segregated all-black school. What was the name of my segregated all-black elementary school? Robert E. Lee Elementary School. Named in 1961 as a reaction to integration. So a Confederate monument is two purposes. One, to show that whites are back in the saddle, 1890 to 1920, or 2, a protest against integration. Either way, it's about white supremacy. Alexandria, which was in the Confederacy for exactly 8 hours before it was occupied by the U.S. Army, has more streets named after Confederates than any other town in America. Named in the 1950s and 60s. Quantrell, for those of you who are historians know, he was a murderous war criminal who slaughtered men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas in the Lawrence Raid. And yet, for ultimate Confederate, you can stand on the corner of Quantrell and Beauregard. It turns out, as I was doing the research for this, that there were plenty of heroes that I should have had, I wish I'd had rather than Robert E. Lee. One of those is Samuel Tucker. And Samuel Tucker said he bootlegged in education. How did he bootleg in education? He had to go 22 blocks because there were no high schools in Alexandria, my hometown, so he had to go to the district to do that. He also then went to Howard, became a lawyer. No law school would take him. He just passed the bar at age 21. And then he led the first sit-in movement, the first sit-in in American history in 1939 in Alexandria at the Alexandria Public Library. I knew nothing about it. This should have been my hero. Then he fought in World War II, was a major in the 92nd Division, and then he and Oliver Hill did over 150 Civil War cases, one of which became Brown versus the Board. That should have been my hero, but it didn't. But today, that's why I have hope. I love my country. I have hope for this. There's no Robert E. Lee Elementary in Alexandria anymore. There is a Samuel Tucker Elementary School in Alexandria. So my dad moves. I lived there till I was 13, 14, and then my dad moved he was a coach and teacher, to take his first headmaster's job. He was in an independent school system, and his first job was at a segregation academy. And in 1969, they finally enforced integration throughout the South. And like mushrooms, these academies were created to ensure that white kids didn't go to school with black kids. And that's where I went to high school. And I did not know the history of my town, Monroe, Georgia, Walton County, that it was the site, and that the big Confederate Monument still there, and there's a tiny little sign on the outskirts of town on this one road talking about the Moores Ford lynching. The last mass lynching in American history happened in my hometown. There were 11 lynchings in Northern Virginia, 9 in Walton County, one of which this had 4 black citizens, 2 men, 2 women, 1 veteran, who were stalked, ambushed, and slaughtered. No one was ever held accountable for that crime, despite the fact that 20 FBI agents went there for 6 months, still could not hold anybody accountable, and still haven't to this day. So that's where I went. And yet I knew nothing of this history. There's an 800-page history of Walton County, does not mention anything about this. And so in the book, I really go into trying to figure out what it is about this lynching, to try to make it evocative so that I would feel what it would have felt like, the terror campaign that it was, and how effective that was to ensure that the South remained a racial police state. But I didn't want to stay in rural Georgia. I wanted to be a Southern gentleman. So I have to be careful when I get, most of my Southern accent is gone right now, but when I start talking like a Virginia gentleman, I too often sound like Foghorn Leghorn. So I'm gonna refrain from, for those of you who are younger, it's a great cartoon, and thank you for laughing at that. Appreciate it. A few of you get the Foghorn, many don't. Great cartoon character. But anyway, so I wanted to be a Virginia gentleman. And what better place to do that than Washington and Lee University, where Lee was college president from 1865 to 1870, where he's buried, where his horse Traveler is buried outside. The bones of his horse are there, and people continue to leave apples for him on his ghostly travails. And they still leave pennies on Traveler, his horse's grave, face down. Why face down? So that the hated Lincoln is not visible to his master. Oh my gosh. And also, I will just tell you this, so that Lincoln will have to kiss Traveler's butt. That was I'm not kidding. So this is where I went to school. It looks like a collegiate Terra almost. So there I am again, more hair. Those were the glory days. And I'm about to get my commission. I took an Army commission, not because I wanted to go in the Army, but because I ran out of money. My parents got divorced. I had no money, so I took an ROTC scholarship. Never thinking I would spend a career in the military. I did get out, but it took me 36 years before I could figure out a way to do that. I'm a very happy civilian now, though. And so there I am about to get my commission. I go by this sort of beautiful picture of Lee, almost like, and then I go and get my commission there in front of the recumbent statue of Lee. And that recumbent statue So it is now called University Chapel. They renamed it, but it was Lee Chapel then. And there in Lee Chapel, there's no Christian iconography. It's a chapel. It's called a chapel. There's no Christian iconography. But there's I was an Episcopalian acolyte for many years, and many of you in this room understand what the Christian iconography. And so there's an apse of the chapel, right? That's where the altar is, where the Holy of Holies is, where you do the Eucharist, right? You follow me? You everybody know that. So except in this chapel, in the apse, on the altar is not where you do the Eucharist, it's where Robert E. Lee is. Literally, he is what's on there. In fact, the first time I brought my lovely bride to see this thing, her reaction was, "Oh my God, get me out of here," because she understood what blasphemy meant. Blasphemy, is having another God, and so it's surrounded here by Confederate flags. So I went and raised my right hand, and I know we've got people in here who here as family members or have themselves raised their right hand and given that oath. Who has? Thank you, sir. Thank you. Many of you, and family members too. When you give that oath to support, look, I can't help it. I still go to the position of attention as soon as I start doing that. To support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I didn't know then that was written in 1862. When it says enemies, foreign and domestic, who are those enemies? They're Confederates. This is an anti-Confederate oath. I took an anti-Confederate oath surrounded by Confederate flags. The enemy's flags. And I didn't know. I had no idea whatsoever. So I start my Army career. And I go to a bunch of, I go to Fort Bragg, Fort Benning. Sherry and I met at Fort Bragg. And who are these named after? Well, I never thought about it until I started doing some research. Well, they're named after some of the worst miscreants, the most awful human beings that you could ever imagine. And not just because they chose treason to preserve slavery, though that's enough in my book, but John Brown Gordon, who's actually a great fighter. He was shot 5 times at the Battle of Antietam. But after the war, he gives a speech to black Charlestonians where he says, if you, the 4 million black people in the South, are to demand equality, the 40 million of us white people will exterminate you in a race war. He founded the Ku Klux Klan and in Georgia, and then went on to be a white supremacist governor and senator. Polk was maybe the worst general on either side. And so there's an old saw among historians that says that the worst cannon shot that the U.S. Army ever took was the one that hit and killed Polk. Because if he had stayed alive longer, the Confederacy would have lost earlier. He was that bad. That's Bragg up there, one of the worst generals. They're just terrible people. Beauregard, we know, raped enslaved women. We know that because his great-great-great-grandson on the black side of the family graduated from West Point in 2011. That's the hope of the American story as well. Pickett executed 23 U.S. Army soldiers.
Could you point them out?
Oh, yeah. So let's see. Beauregard, Rucker, Hood, Pickett. Pickett executed 23 U.S. Army soldiers. Polk, Brown, Bragg, A.P. Hill, and Benning. Benning never did much of anything, never served in the U.S. Army. Benning and Gordon never served, that's John Brown Gordon, never served in the U.S. Army. So we've named these after the enemy that never served in the U.S. Army but did kill U.S. Army soldiers. So why? Well, I started researching. I tried to figure out why did we name them. We named them in World War I and World War II. Let me just read you this one quote. Because the Army was a white supremacist organization. The United States was a racial police state, particularly in the South, and it was all controlled by the Democratic Party, and they controlled all the major, the House Senate Armed Services Committee, everything. They controlled it because, remember, black people couldn't vote, and they were 40, 50% in some places. So John Pershing, who commanded the U.S. forces in France, said, we must not eat with them, must not shake hands with them, seek to talk to them, or meet with them outside of the requirements of military service, talking about black soldiers. So World War I, completely segregated. In the interwar period, this is what Army planners said about black soldiers. The Negro is lower in the scale of evolutionary development than the white. It doesn't get any more racist than that. That's the Army saying this. So they named them in World War I and World War II. This wasn't named in the 1870s or 80s. It wasn't meant to bring us back together. Remember, the United States of America, it's not the Union, it's the United States of America. The United States of America graciously granted amnesty to all Confederates in 1868. Graciously let them back in without hanging but one, and only one person hanged, and that was the head of the camp at Andersonville Prison. The only person hanged. There had already been reconciliation. This isn't about reconciliation. This is about ensuring a racial police state. So there are other things of this. This is probably, I think, the worst, one of the worst. This is the Arlington Confederate Monument. And it was put there in 1914 when Woodrow Wilson, who was our most racist president, and if you see, there's this figure here of an enslaved woman, a quote-unquote mammy figure, overweight. There were no overweight enslaved women. I'm just telling you, zero. And she has a tear in her eye as she takes the baby from her Confederate, quote, master to show her support for the war, to show that the enslaved, there were happy slaves, happy to be there. Again, false. Here, down here, that's another enslaved servant, not a soldier, because the number of Confederate black soldiers is a nice round number. 0. But he is a body servant, but to show, see how he said, I'm proud to be going there. This is meant to say that the white South was right, will always be right, the white North is wrong and will always be wrong. Then I went to West Point, and I spent the last half of my career so proud. Bill and I served together there. And it was one day when I was living with Sherry and our boys, we're living on Lee Road, by Lee Gate, in Lee Housing Area, by Lee Child Development Center, and then I stopped by Lee Barracks, and I went, why is it that all these things at West Point are named after Confederates? And that made me start thinking, why is it? And what I found was that in the 19th century, they were banished from they were banished from memory. The Confederates were banished from West Point for treason. Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, the only crime in the Constitution is levying war against the United States. Did Lee levy war against the United States? If one thing is clear, it's got to be that. So our great monument, which says the War of the Rebellion on there, love that. That's the official name of the war, the Civil War in the 19th century, the War of the Rebellion. Or you could call it what Frederick Douglass did, the Slaveholders' Rebellion. Love that too. War between the states, that's what Jefferson Davis said. We don't want to do that. That makes them two equal partners. This is the United States of America against an insurrectionist force that would not accept the results of a democratic election. So none there, none in our memorial hall, none in our cemetery. Duty, honor, country, our great motto. Anti-Confederate. Duty and honor only matter if it's for country. So when did they come? And this is what really changed me. I said, wow, they didn't do it in the 19th century. When did they name these things? Well, they named Lee Road in the 1930s. What happened in the 30s? The first black cadet comes back. After more than a 50-year absence, the first black cadet graduates in 1936. He's there. Why 1950s? Here, you see there's an enslaved servant right there. The Army is being forced to integrate, and it's slow rolling it. It only does it because of the Korean War. Truman orders it to integrate, it doesn't. More integration. How about here, 1970? They start minority admissions program after King's assassination. So these top ones, scratch a Confederate monument at West Point, it's a reaction to integration. And that ticked me off so much that I had bought these lies when it was about white supremacy, it was about trying to protest against integration. And then there are these that came about in the 21st century. It's hard even to figure out why they would do that. But we have it as late as 2002, memorializing Lee. So let's talk about Lee. So this is the point when I'm giving talks in the South that people start going, they go, Okay, I got all that, but are you going to go after Robert E. Lee? Sir, are you going to go after Robert E. Lee? Well, buckle in, ladies and gentlemen, because here we go. Treason. Oh, yeah. Treason. Article 3, Section 3, I already mentioned that. Many of his family members did not go with did not go with the Confederacy. Most of them didn't. His sister never talked to him again. When his daughter found out that he was going to do this and talk to them, she said that his word was, "I think you'll be surprised by my decision." Treason. There were 8 U.S. Army colonels from Virginia in 1861. 8. 7 remained loyal to the United States, all West Point graduates. 8 chose 8. 7 remained loyal, and 1 and only 1 chose treason. And I'm not saying that somehow that this is a presentist argument. I'm saying about treason. It's what they said at the time. It's what all the United States Army officers said. Why choose treason? It's what George Thomas, the great Virginian, said. It's what Winfield Scott, the great Virginian, said. All of them said, you're throwing away this for treason. And by the way, he couldn't even wait. He couldn't even wait the 3 days it took to process his resignation before he accepted a commission with Virginia. So he was actually being paid twice for several days, being paid by both sides. So treason is that he chose to fight against his country. And remember, he killed U.S. Army soldiers. No other enemy general in our history has been responsible for the deaths of more U.S. Army soldiers than Robert E. Lee. As somebody who served in my country, in my uniform for 36 years, who has friends buried that were killed in combat, the cadets that I taught, buried in the West Point Cemetery, Section 36, the idea that I would honor someone who chose treason to preserve slavery, but who killed U.S. Army soldiers, no, those are not my heroes. So treason. Why did he choose treason? To preserve slavery. In 1857, his father-in-law dies, and he gets 2 years of paid administrative leave to go back to Virginia, to leave his regiment in Texas, go to Virginia and run Arlington. 2.5 years, paid by the government. Winfield Scott allows him to do this. During that time, he becomes a planter, a slaver. And his father-in-law recognized enslaved marriages. He didn't. Broke them apart. His father-in-law refused to use the whip hand. Lee whipped enslaved people. Every time he had a chance to choose between human decency and profit, he chose profit. He kept them enslaved for as long as he possibly could. And then during the war, as his army went north into Antietam in the Gettysburg campaign, his army, every part of his army, kidnapped free black people and brought them back to Virginia for sale. And then his army refused to accept black prisoners of war and slaughtered them on sight, to include their officers. After the war, he gives a brief to Congress. He is there, goes to Congress in 1866, and says, he's asked, what should you think we should do with the freedmen, with the recently freed people, the black people of the South? Well, he says, I can tell you what we should do in Virginia. If it was up to me, I would kick every black person out of the state of Virginia. He wants to do ethnic cleansing. And at no time, he sends out a manifesto in 1868 with Alexander Stephens, the guy who wrote this famous Cornerstone speech saying that we're fighting for Negro slavery. And he sends that out saying that the black people of the South are meant only for a laboring class. They should never have political power. Whatever you do, don't do that. So he went to the end of his days never apologizing for that. However, if I would say what's his finest hour? His finest hour is in 1866, I think, when he submits a pardon, acknowledging treason and saying that he would support emancipation. It's not signed. It's not signed because Andrew Johnson refuses to sign it, but he is given a general amnesty. So pardon is for one person, amnesty is for a bunch. He's given that general amnesty in 1868. So he has provided amnesty for treason. So yeah, so does he see, the thing about monuments is commemoration is about our values. It's not history. Commemoration is about our values. At West Point, every year, Lee's going to win the Battle of Chancellorsville. Guaranteed every time. Hooker's going to lose. Lee's going to win. That's the history. But commemoration is about who your society values. And at least for me, these aren't the values that I think of for the United States of America. So I've been doing this, and again, Sherry would sort of help me get that. I grew up in a culture that lied. I grew up in a culture based on lies, this lost cause myth. Sherry is incapable of lying. So she's been working on me for these many years. So I was invited back to Lee Chapel to give a talk on Constitution Day, a month after the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville. And I was nervous in the service. And I ended up talking and saying that Lee was a traitor for slavery on Lee Chapel above his grave. That's what I'm doing there, framed by the recumbent statue. What was the reaction? I got a standing ovation. I know, shocked the hell out of me too. But what I realize is that if I was willing to tell my own story first, which is what I did, tell my own story and be vulnerable enough to say I was wrong, that maybe other people would be willing to do that too. And that's really, I think, what led me to do the book, is to say that if I do it myself, if I'm honest about my own story, maybe others will be willing to talk about it. And that's what's happened. I've gotten so many positive notes of people that say they grew up just like me, but don't want to do that anymore. But that's not the only type of response I get. So over on the right here, you can see me and Vladimir Lenin here. And so it says, let's see who's behind removing the Arlington Confederate Monument. So I get trolled all the time. And this is a Scooby-Doo guy. It turns out it's my head, but I'm really Lenin. That's Vladimir Lenin, communist. So I get called communist, Marxist, person who's not a person who doesn't believe in America. Well, that's just not true. I love my country. That's why I'm doing this. I am a patriot. That's why I want to make sure that what it represents us. And then I get 1-star reviews on Amazon all the time. This one says, would give it 0 stars if that was an option. No scholarship here, just leftist political lies. Lee was a great man and a great Virginian. I think this book isn't fit to line my cat's litter box. So I get prostitution is legal for writers. So I get these all the time. I get horrible things sent to me. The last one I was on, so I was featured on Steve Bannon's War Room. So Steve Bannon, political operative, and this guy came on and for 12 minutes called me a scumbag weasel. And so I know, but I like it. I like it because I know that if those people are reacting to me that way, I'm talking honestly enough, straightforwardly enough, and using the facts enough that I'm getting under their skin. So sometimes it's more important who hates you than who likes you. And I'll just say one question, the one on the far left, and that is that it went by a picture of Charles Sumner, the flag of treason, in the People's House, went by the flag of Charles Sumner. Sumner guy, Sherry and I were just in the Capitol recently at the place where he was nearly beaten to death by a slaver who hated the fact that Charles Sumner was saying bad things about slavery. Beat him with a gold-tipped cane till he almost died, and was out for 4 years with traumatic brain injury. So that's the level of violence. This is 1857. When he came back, he's the one that, Charles Sumner, the one that wrote the oath that we all take to this day. He's the one that wrote it. But so to see the flag of treason go by this great abolitionist picture just drove me crazy. But there are more good news. I was on this naming commission, and guess what? We renamed all those posts. Everything I wrote about in that book, almost not, except for Monroe, Georgia, everything else has changed. I finished this book in 2019. It came out in early 21, yet almost everything at West Point will have changed. Everything in the Department of Defense will have changed. Everything in Alexandria, Virginia has changed. Amazing. You know, Churchill once said about Americans, you can count on us to do the right, you can count on us to do the right thing after we've exhausted all other options. So look at this, the great group of people, and I'd be happy to go through this in question and answer, but great people that we've named these new posts after. So I come back to the beginning, which is, you may have been a little uncomfortable, but you know, uncomfortable causes no lasting damage. Uncomfortable isn't like living in the slavery area. It's not like being in the segregation South. Uncomfortable just feels weird. But uncomfortable is also, another word for it, is education. So the only way for us as a nation, I believe, to prevent a racist future is to first understand our racist past. Thank you very much.
That was outstanding. Thank you so much. So there are some microphones in the back. I'm sure you've got some questions, so I'm going to let the microphones come down. If you've got a question, show me your hand and we'll get one over to you. While folks are pondering, here's one down here. We'll get a microphone down here. General, I wonder if you could just say, in the title of your book, A Southerner's Reckoning, you've reckoned with this history, what it's meant for you. You leave us with some hope at the end, which thank you for that. But it feels like in the year 2022, we still have a lot more reckoning to do as a nation. And I wonder, beyond the renaming of those bases and the displacement of some of those statues in the South, what more do we need to do as a nation to really reckon with this history, to create this future that's less racist than our past?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm a historian, so I do believe that to make change, you've got to explain to people why change needs to be made. You need to explain why black families have 1/10 the wealth of white families. You need to explain why we are in this situation. So and I think the only way to do that is to educate, is to explain. So one of the things to say is, well, you know, Social Security was an affirmative action program for white people. So when affirmative action first came out in the 1930s, the white segregationists who controlled the House and Senate said, listen, no laborers, no domestics, no farm workers can have it. And why? I've read the congressional testimony. If a black man gets a pension, the rest of the family won't work. So it was just racism. So affirmative action was white in the 1930s. And the GI Bill was white. And the FHA and VA loans. So all of these things over a course of a century were U.S. policy that created the situation that we're in now. And the only way that you would know that things have to change is to understand why those came about. So I do believe, like what you're doing here, and I know Bill is doing that in his class, I know the great professors that are here doing that, is to engage with that. Another way of doing it is to engage with your own personal history. That's what I did. That's really what changed me. But you know, we used to say that what at History Department at West Point is what a person researches and writes can change their character, can change their worldview, and that's what happened to me. You know, so I do think that if you understand the history of whether it's Newport or Rhode Island or Virginia or our country, you end up being willing to think about change. And if you don't know that, then you will think, why do you need to change? There's no reason to. You've got to understand the history.
I love a good commercial for more history majors.
Listen, I just want to say that all the majors here at Salve are great. All the majors are great. It's just that history is a little bit greater. What do you think, Bill? And I looked. I get amen from the chorus here. Well done.
So right down here.
Wonderful. That was excellent. Thank you very much. I agree with everything you said. Like yourself, I'm a retired career Army officer. First three installations I was assigned to were Fort Polk, Fort Benning, Fort Bragg. I asked the same questions. This is back in the 70s. Why are these places named after people that fought against our country? Refreshing that they're being renamed. There are still places on Fort Bragg. The longest street on Fort Bragg is called Long Street after General Longstreet.
No.
No?
No, it's Long Street, but not named after Long. It was predates the war. So they're now going to call it. It was Long Street, one word. Now they're making it Long Street. But there are 1,111 things in the Department of Defense named after Confederates. Every damn one of them is going to change.
I stand corrected. That's good to hear. Critical race theory. There's this effort to continue to suppress African Americans and to deny them the rights that we all take for granted. What is the way forward for something like that? And I have a personal friend that I served with, lives here in Rhode Island, and is opposed to taking down statues to Confederate generals. I disagree, but what is the way forward?
Well, I think there's a couple of way forwards. The first is to remember that commemoration is not history. So we're not changing history, we're changing commemoration. And remember that what is helpful when every time you think about it is we historians do, what's the context that these were named? So often the best thing to do is read the speech that was given when the statue came up. And the best example of that is the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and they had a Silent Sam statue there. And it had been up there for years. Nobody was going to move it. And then a friend of mine went into the archives. He's a grad student there, and found the speech that was given when they put that statue up. That's a Confederate soldier, and it's nicknamed Silent Sam. And they read the speech, and it said, and the guy who was up at the lectern, it was a Confederate veteran, and he said proudly, when I was here, when I was here right after the war, a young, he didn't use this word, I'll say it, a young black woman was mouthing off to a white lady. So I tied her up to the post and whipped her right then. That was the speech at the dedication ceremony of the monument. So if you read these speeches, and I have read a bunch, they all mention Anglo-Saxon, various forms of white supremacy. That's what they're there for, because the magnanimity had already been given in the 1860s and 1870s to bring white Southerners in and not hang any of them. So I think understanding that is one. The idea of critical race theory is, I'm a historian who studied the history of race. I'd never heard of it because it was a legal theory. It is meant because there are people that are worried about race. They don't want to talk about it. And this is a way of doing that. But here's the thing. They're fighting a rearguard action. The thing is, when I was growing up, you couldn't find the secession documents. Everybody here has got a computer in your pocket, and in 2 seconds, who here has seen the secession documents? Anybody read them before? Yeah. And Bill, I know, has read them. So all you have to go into home, read the secession declarations of the southern states, or read the cornerstone speech that Alexander Stephens gave, which says we're fighting this war for Negro slavery. So they know they're in a rearguard action. It's politically expedient right now, and it's working. Tough to be a social studies teacher in a K through 12 right now in many places around. But I do think it's a rearguard action, but we have to be willing to call them out as best we can. I certainly try it whenever I can, but I got to tell you, it feels scary for some of those people in those states who are teaching it.
One last thing. Sure. Like it or not, this is our history.
It is.
Are there any movements out there to put these statues in museums? I mean, we don't want to forget this either.
Well, the thing is that they're so huge. They're huge. I mean, what do you do? So the one, the Confederate one, we recommended that we get rid of it. We're going to get rid of it. Destroy it. The problem with it is that it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to store that thing. You can't, this idea that, I made up a verb here, you can't Raiders of the Lost Ark it. Put it in some warehouse. There's no museum that's big enough to take all these. Now, you could be like Hungary. They had a great idea. This was before Orban. They took all the Lenin, Marx, Engels, Stalin statues, and they put them in one place, one park. You can go to and see all of them in one spot. We're a federal system. It's state, local, federal. You can't touch any of those. And you can't touch the ones that are in the national park system. There's a law that says don't touch any of those. So we still have, if anybody's been to the Manassas battlefield, which should be named Bull Run. Manassas is the Confederate name. And that's what Virginia made sure it was. And there you can see Stonewall Jackson, or as I like to call him, Jacked Jackson. He makes Schwarzenegger look little. He's got muscles upon muscles upon muscles. And his horse, Little Sorrel, poor steroidal Little Sorrel, has got so many muscles you can't believe it. So yeah, we have a lot of work still to do. We are in the early innings of this. But if you don't deal with your history, you get to the problems that we have now. And that's the problem. The Germans have been dealing with the Holocaust, and they're better for it. We have not been dealing with our history. If you deal with your history, like we're all doing today, you feel uncomfortable, and you have a way forward. If you do the three blind mice, you can't do that.
Question here.
Yeah, yes, please.
Microphone's going to come right down to you.
Oh, okay.
Others, if you got questions, just catch my eye, we'll come to you.
So firstly, thank you. That was terrific. So I've been thinking about correct me if I'm wrong, the Daughters of the Confederacy.
Oh, yeah, United Daughters of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good for you.
Wasn't that developed or begun in like the early 1900s as a means of appreciating our Southern heritage, right? And probably helping to put up some of these Confederate monuments.
Most of them.
Yeah. So how do we address that today when it seems to be so ingrained, especially in the South? Education can only do so much, right?
Right.
what can we do as a society to try and negate all the negative impacts that have come from that?
Yeah, the United Daughters of the Confederacy are the most successful propagandists in American history, without a doubt. And they did this without the vote. Really amazing that these women went through, raised the money, and created all of these statues. They're the ones that forced, they burned books in the South to make sure that the textbooks that we had then, the early part of the 20th century, said that slavery was a positive good, that the war wasn't started about slavery. They started Children of the Confederacy, which are still extant to this day. And you can go on their website, and still to this day, the Children of the Confederacy, founded in Alexandria, Virginia, you can memorize that lost cause, all those myths, memorize those for scholarship money. But I will tell you, Sherry and I were in Richmond, and they now have a new statue that is right next to the UDC headquarters. And the UDC headquarters looks like a Soviet bunker. And it now really looks like that because standing over it is a statue that looks like the Jeb Stuart statue. It's a heroic guy on horseback, leaning back like this, except instead of being a Confederate, it's a black man with dreadlocks, a hoodie, and Nikes. And it dominates the Confederate, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So they're losing. They are losing. And the idea, listen, when we finished our commission report, gave our report to Congress, gave it to the Secretary of Defense, there has not been one politician on either side of the aisle that has criticized our thing or said we should change it at all. Not one, local, state, or federal. So I do have hope that Americans are seeing through at least this one part to see that Confederates don't represent the American people. They chose treason to preserve slavery. And so the language we use matters. It's not the Union, it's the United States. I sometimes use enslaved labor farm instead of plantation. Why? Because they were farming two things. They were enslaved people there. A plantation makes you think of terror and the wind whispering through the Spanish moss. No, it's a place, it's a gulag, a place of terror. And there they were farming cotton and humans. Because remember, they were enforced breeding to ensure that the maximum number of human beings were born. This is a site of mass atrocities. And as you start to understand that and use that language, it's impossible to see that. You think Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, they got married at a plantation. What did they do now? They have disavowed it, apologized 100 times, and said, oh my God, we were wrong, wrong, wrong. So everything in popular culture is changing. Look at the movies, 12 Years a Slave, Harriet, Django Unchained. All these things are changing. And so that's why these people arguing against CRT are so worried, because they know they're losing. And they will lose, because the facts are on one side and our values are on one side, and racism and hatred are on the other.
Thank you. That makes sense.
We've got a question right down here.
This year I traveled to Charleston, South Carolina over the summer, and I discovered two things. One, Fort Sumter, which was really interesting, and two, the Citadel, which my father explained to me should not exist because they were the first people to fire the shots of the Civil War for the Confederacy. I want to hear what your opinion is on the Citadel and how their history can be changed in a way where it can be for good instead of it being a place where the Confederacy was basically born.
Yeah, and it's even worse than that for the Citadel, because the Citadel it's talking about was actually created after the Nat Turner Rebellion to ensure that there was a fortification to protect against slave rebellions. So it's really, it's up to its eyeballs in this lost cause ideology. They have been getting after it some. VMI is having more problems right now because they got rid of the Jackson statue. They have a black superintendent, but now they had a governor who was really supporting them, and Ralph Northam. Now it's a Republican who is not supporting those changes and took the black Board of Trustee members off. So this is the thing about state-run institutions, is you have a higher headquarters. At West Point, we were not allowed to move anything until Congress told us to. We didn't go co-ed till Congress told us to. We didn't integrate till Congress forced us to do both. So with these state institutions, until the state itself changes, it's going to be problematic for those institutions. Having said that, I know a couple people at the Citadel. They are teaching classes about that. VMI is teaching classes about that. But the alumni, which are older and Before women came, it is terrible. The other thing with those military academies, particularly in the South, is the misogyny is really tough there too. So yeah, they have problems there, and some of them are working through it, some of them aren't, but every time they do a change, it is fraught. It is fraught because, again, history is dangerous because it challenges our myths and our identities, and when somebody challenges that myth or identity, the reaction can be ferocious. It's a good question.
We got two questions right down here. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, let's use that so everybody can hear.
Oh, thank you so much. That was just really fantastic. I'm a historian, and one of the things that I've been talking to people about recently is for those of us who grew up in the North, we were taught North good, South bad, North free, South slaves. And that's what we grew up with. And now we are discovering that how closely and intimately the North was tied to the South. Here in Newport, we have the obvious slave trade.
Right.
That was so, this was the center, the epicenter.
Right.
In the 18th century. But we also have businesses that were supplying the plantations.
Right.
They couldn't have survived without the cloth and the produce and other things that were. So we don't have the Confederate monuments. We have Ambrose Burnside in Providence.
Right, right.
But we have a history here in the North.
Right.
And we were, sort of insulated from that because we were able to point to the South and say, they're the bad ones and we're the good ones.
Right.
And I think it's just so exhilarating to hear your talking because it really reinforces that we are all in this.
All of us.
Together.
Yeah, I think we're all in it, and we all have a history. Every town has a history, and probably there's redlining somewhere around here, where they created areas where the black people could not get mortgages. And segregation. And so all these things are here. And again, the only way to solve those problems is to first understand the context of why they're there. And every town, and I think that's great. Bill was telling me about how he has his students go in and look at the primary sources just about Salve, right? I mean, you go have them write about that. But if you use those primary sources, it transforms the way you think about history, if you get to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons, when I was growing up, it was memorization, memorization, memorization. That's all history was. And I think history is too important to be boring. It's too important to be boring. And if history is boring, then we're doing it wrong. And talking about your local area is one of the ways to keep it from being boring, to make sure that you understand about yourself and your community. So I applaud you. I think it's exactly the right way to go.
Yeah. So you mentioned the renaming of some of the military bases.
Yeah.
I recognize some of those folks.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about who some of the people that are going to be honored instead
Love
are.
to. One of my favorite things to do. Starting in the upper left. Chief Warrant Officer Novosel, Mike Novosel. So a Chief Warrant Officer never named something after him. He was a pilot in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II, got out. They needed pilots for Vietnam, came back in his 40s, and went to Vietnam, received the Medal of Honor for saving I don't know how many different people. One of whom was his son, who was also a helicopter pilot there. Later on, his son saved him. And he ended up retiring, Medal of Honor recipient, ended up retiring there in that area in Lower Alabama, L.A. as we called it, Lower Alabama, where the fort, where now Fort Novosel will be. So it'll be named after him. First time we've done that. This is Sergeant later Colonel Barfoot, Choctaw Indian, who received the Medal of Honor in Italy, originally from Mississippi, and settled in Virginia after the war. That's going to be where Fort Pickett is. And just an incredible story of bravery to receive the Medal of Honor. Liberty is where Bragg is. One of our remits from Congress was to make sure that we listen to local sensitivities. And man, the Bragg community, they're a contentious lot. And they wanted to make sure that they wanted the idea of liberty. And so that they unified behind it. So liberty, this idea, and I mean, I like it, the idea that, what we fight for. And this idea of liberty that has ever-changing. This is something we all fight over. What does liberty mean? Certainly liberty to the 1850s to white Southerners meant the liberty to have slaves. We think of that differently now, so I think it's fascinating to think about the different ways that we're doing liberty. General Henry Cavazos, The first Latino to be a 4-star, grew up, this is where Hood is now, will be in Texas, grew up on the King Ranch, went to Texas Tech, and later commanded what is Hood will be Fort Cavazos. I love this fact. Didn't go into our thinking at all, but the 1st Cavalry Division is there, and the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. So Cavazos, the fact that we can call it Fort Cav, is pretty cool too. Pretty cool too. Ike, you may have heard of him. Isn't there something here in locally named?
The Eisenhower house where he summered.
That's right, where he summered. He summered. Bill was telling me the story where he summered here. So I don't think I need to tell much about him. Mary Walker, the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor. She stayed with her soldiers during the Civil War. You can see her wearing the Medal of Honor. Stayed with her soldiers, even though she was sure that she was going to be captured. Spent 6 months in a POW camp, and both the senior generals, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, all worked to make sure that she got the Medal of Honor. A doctor, a civilian, because they did not allow women into the Army during the Civil War. So we've named one after a civilian who worked in the Army. First time that's happened. The other here, Arthur Gregg, still alive. He's 96 years old. Desegregated the logistics corps, so that's where Fort Lee is now, home of Army logistics. And so we're proud to name these after logisticians. And the Army's got the finest logisticians in the history of the world. So he was a great logistician. Charity Adams was the highest ranking black woman during World War II, famous for her unit delivered more mail than it took 3 units to take her place. One of the great heroes of World War II. In the center, and that's going to be Fort Lee. Where Fort Benning is now is the Moore family. So not just named after him, but them together, the family. And if you've ever met a military spouse, you know it takes a family to serve the nation. And so we're recognizing that as well. And so I'll talk to her first. Julia it used to be that Army that when a casualty was notified, let's say you're the family members and your loved one has either been wounded or killed in action, a cab driver would come up with a telegram and give that telegram to the family. And she was like, no, you cannot be so heartless. So she actually made every cab driver at Fort Benning at the time Benning or Campbell, stop at her house. She would go with them to deliver that note. And she forced the Army to start what is today a casualty notification, where a chaplain and an officer in uniform goes to notify. And her husband, Hal Moore, famous if you've ever seen the movie We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson, he was the hero of that. So also a great soldier, but even a great family. And on the far right, Henry Johnson. Johnson received the Medal of Honor World War I. Remember when I told you Pershing, how much he hated black soldiers? He gave away an entire division, 20,000 soldiers, black soldiers, to the French, and they wore French uniforms. And this guy, in one battle, saved his platoon, was wounded 21 times. My favorite story about him, though, the thing about history is it's about storytelling. History is storytelling with a purpose using evidence. So the story that I love to tell about him is he comes back in 1919. Heralded, Teddy Roosevelt called him one of the great soldiers of the war. And he comes back and he goes up to Harlem. And Harlem, they said, it goes into into that part, and they see him coming. They know about it. Henry Johnson, he's like 5'3". They know he's coming, and his nickname was Black Death. And so you can see it coming as he goes up. So they start singing as he goes, here comes Black Death. And they do this all the way through Harlem. And he ends up dying. Nobody knows about him. Ends up dying. And he doesn't get the Medal of Honor until President Obama gives it to him nearly 100 years later. So those are the 9. Those are and one of the things that we're sort of that I'm thinking about at West Point, over the academic boardroom, they were these 3 heathens, 3 Jews, 3 Christians that were called the 9 Worthies. And they were meant to at West Point to make sure that we were making the right decisions about cadets. And I think about these now, and I think we have the new 9 Worthies that represent who we are as Americans, and will inspire not just soldiers where these are stationed, but all Americans. So I'm really proud to recognize those Americans, many of whom you probably have never heard of, but you will now.
We got time for one more question.
So first, I wanted to thank you so much for coming and speaking to us and giving our book club this incredible kind of educational material for us to discuss. And second, if you were willing to share, I was wondering if you had these I feel like you had to have had these tough conversations with your family.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you were able to bring any of them along with you to this educational kind of peak, and if you had any advice on how anyone who has family members or friends who kind of are still stuck in that, the myth of the Southern, cause, how we could start those conversations.
So yes, my dad is still with us. He's 91, still in great shape, plays tennis 4 days a week. Proud to say he is the over 90 doubles champion in the state of Florida. He and his 96-year-old partner were the only entry. But he's the one that grew up. He was an orphan, grew up in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi as an orphan. And he used to tell me the story, I forgot to put it in the book, I wish I had, that he and his brother used to race into church, Episcopal church, used to race into church. I said, Dad, no 6-year-old boy races into church. That just doesn't happen. Well, maybe here. But at least in my experience, don't race into church. And he said, well, Ty, we fought to sit in that one pew. And I said, well, what was so special about that one pew? Well, right above it was this plaque that said, here sat Jefferson Davis during church service, former president of the Confederacy. And I went, oh, geez. Woo. And he had that thing. But his idea was he was an orphan. Seidule is not some fancy Southern name, So he had this idea that he wanted to be a Southern gentleman, Virginia gentleman. And so that's really what he sort of created himself. So when I was doing this, I talked to him for a decade about this. And in the end, and he used to say, my name's Jim Seidule, like Robert E. Lee, my hero. That's what he would say. Seidule, like Lee, my hero. And so, yeah, he had it. He was in deep. And I went through and would talk to him about this over and over again. And we finally came to the realization, he came to the realization, and it's close, that he loves me more than Robert E. Lee. It was close. So I have been talking to him for years. And so, yeah, there are lots of people that accept me. There are lots of people that don't. But I think part of it is to tell your truth. And to be vulnerable enough to say, I've learned this, and it's important to me. And that's part of what it is to say, I understand this is important to you, but you've got to be vulnerable enough to say, this is important to me. And here's what I learned. There's a reason why your parents send you to college. There's a reason why your grandparents are going to be so proud of you to graduate. It's because you're going to learn things here. You're going to learn things that will challenge you. And if you don't, then talk to the president and tell her. But you do, of course you do. You're telling me you do. So I think this is this idea of being vulnerable yourself and saying, listen, this is important to me. Here's why it's important. That's the best way to do it, is to lead about yourself and not just about how stupid they are, even if they may be.
The book is Robert E. Lee and Me. It is for sale out in the lobby, and I know that the General would be happy to sign it for you after the event. General Ty Seidule, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks.